Hey, what's good with y'all, man? It's your boy Swifty. Today I'm gonna break down how to make ambient R&B loops for Drake and the style of stuff you could hear on Certified Lover Boy. So first, I opened up Keyscape, loaded up this preset right there. First, I went into the piano roll. I went to my little arrow up there, to the helpers, scale highlighting. Then I selected F and major. So I just made a little simple pattern. For the first chord, I used my root note right there, the F. And then I skipped one note that's light shaded, the ones that are in the scale, not the dark shaded ones that are not in the scale. You don't want to use them. I skipped one note that I can use, and I use the next one, which is the A. And then instead of doing a triad, which would be skipping one more and using the C right there, I just duplicated the A. I put it down an octave because I wanted that to be my bass note. I wanted to switch it up a little bit and not use the root note for the bass. And then to fill in the chord, I don't really know that much music theory. I just tried to hear what sounded good to me, and I just put that note right there. That creates a lot of tension because it's next to another note. And then to fill in the gap between this note and the F, I just skipped one note and used the one in the middle. Then I just duplicated that chord right there. As you can see, instead of having my root note, which was the A for the chord, I put it down to G, and I just duplicated that. And then I just switched up the three notes in the middle. So then once I got that 4-bar pattern, I just duplicated that over, and I'm gonna let you hear it without the effects. Now for the effects, I added RC20. I just turned off the noise, the digital, the space. I turned the wobble down a little bit. I turned up the distortion. Then I kept this one by default. Next, I added Valhalla Vintage Verb as always. This is the default preset. I just turned down the mix a little bit and the decay as well. Also turned up the low cut. Next, I used the stereo control just to make it a little bit wider. Lastly, an EQ. So as you can see, I cut a lot of frequencies out. Most of the highs are gone and all the lows are gone. I just skipped some mids and low mids. And also you can see I ducked down some of the frequencies that were too harsh. This time I'm gonna let you hear the pattern with the effects. So next I used the bell from a one-shot kit. So then I went into the envelope and I just turned the hold all the way up, and I turned down the attack, but not all the way down, just skipped a little bit. And then as you can see, I just copied over the chords from the Rhodes. I just put them an octave down, and as you can see, I just made the chords a little shorter. So this is what the bell sounds like without effects. So for the effects, I put Echo Boy with the preset Ambient Echoes, and I just made sure the Echo 1 and Echo 2 were both on 1/4 trip. And I turned the mix down a little bit. And here too, the mix level, I turned that down to 50%. Then I put a Vintage Verb. I used a preset called Huge Guitar Space. I just turned the mix down, the decay down a little bit. Next I put a halftime, and I turned the mix down to 10%. Then I used a plugin called Trem Control. I just used the default preset, and I just messed around with the shape a little bit. Then next I used an EQ to get rid of some harsh frequencies. Then I used the Pancake. That's a free plugin. I just turned the mix down to 64%. And lastly, an EQ, cutting the highs, the lows, and some harsh frequencies in the middle. And now this is what the bell sounds like with the effects. Alright, so next I opened up the Noir Pure Piano in Kontakt. I used a preset called In Concert, and what I did for the pattern, I just copied the chords from the main Rhodes, and I just added notes in between. So these are the notes that I added, just a simple melody. I just came up with it in my head and then tried to replicate it by clicking the notes in. And also, as you can see, I added a bass pattern, so I just followed the notes that I used for the chords. There wasn't a reason for me to use these notes. I really just heard the chords and I tried to place a note that sounded good with them. But as you can see, they all have something in common, is that they are a part of the chord right there. That's what's important for it to sound good. I'm gonna let you hear it without effects. So as you can see, it's pretty dry. So I added a Vintage Verb with the mix all the way up, the decay super high, and I turned down the mix level here. Then I added another one, this time with the mix down, the decay down. Then I used the same RC20 that I used for the Rhodes. This time I put the space on. Then again, the stereo control, just a little bit. And lastly, an EQ, where I just cut the lows and cut some of the highs. That's really the key to get that vintage feeling, is cutting the highs a lot on your instruments. So now I'm gonna let you hear it with the effects. Alright, so next I used another one shot. I made sure that I put the time mode to stretch. That way it just doesn't play faster or slower depending on the note that you're using. Then I just went in there and I used the root note of the scale, which is the F. This is what it sounds like without the effects. So as you can see, it's super quiet. So I just added the vintage verb again, mix pretty high, decay pretty high, copied the RC20 from the piano, put the zero control all the way up, and I used an EQ to cut the lows and some of the highs. And now I'm gonna let you hear with the effects. As you can see, it's really not that loud. It's something in a bag that you don't really notice, but it just adds to the feeling of it. Next, I used another one shot. I also put the time mode to stretch, and as you can see, again, I just used the root note, the F. I'm gonna let you hear it without the effects. Now for the effects, I just copied the ones from the first one shot, but I changed the preset for the vintage verb. I used the dark string chamber, turned the decay pretty high, but turned the mix down. Same RC20, zero control turned down a little bit, and the same EQ. I just took out less highs than the first one shot, and this is what it sounds like with the effects. So next I opened up Arcade and I went into the hooked library and I used a band called Stay Tonight. Then I came up with this little pattern. I'm just let you hear it without the effects. For the effects, I used the Valhalla delay. Next I used the reverb. Then I used the lava filter. Next I put a pancake on it so it goes from the left ear to the right ear. Next I put the serial control to 160 so it's pretty wide. And lastly an EQ, just like the lava filter, making sure I cut the lows and the highs to get that radio type of effect. And this is what the vocals sound like with the effects. Alright, so what I did next is I added a bass. It's a one shot. I just went into the envelope and I made a square by turning everything down and turning the hold all the way up. And next I just copied the root notes that I used on the piano and I just played that over and over. On the effects, I just cut some of the highs and I cut some of the very lows. So the effects don't really make that much of a difference, so I'm gonna let you hear it. Alright, so the last thing, as you can see, I added a drum loop. So for that, I just created a new pattern. I called it drum loop, and I just used drums from a boom bap drum kit, a free one that I found on YouTube. This is what the drums sound like. So they are all rooted to a mixer track. On that mixer track, I turned down the volume a little bit and I put a lot of effects. So I used an EQ to cut the lows and the highs. Next I used the capitator and I used the preset right there, Lo-Fi Kit 1. I just made sure to turn down the mix level to 50%. Then I put a reverb. Then I copied the low filter from the vocals, used the pancake, turned down the mix to 50%. And lastly another EQ to make sure I cut the lows. And then for the pattern, I didn't want to make something that you would make when you make a beat over the loop. I wanted to make something that's subtle and that would go well if I added drums on top of it. So as you can see, there's a lot of space between the drums. It's nothing crazy, so I'm gonna just let you hear it. Alright, so the last thing I did to this loop, I routed every single instrument that I had to this mixer track right there. I turned the volume down a little bit because I added a plugin called Vinyl Strip, and I used the Pump Master Clean preset and I just tweaked it a little bit. And I turned down the mix level and I also made sure that I cut the lows. And what this does basically is it gives a vintage feeling. And as you can see right there, there's a little bit of vinyl noise going on. So this is what a vinyl sample sounds like. Alright, so as you can see, it's really something that Drake would have hopped on CLB. I hope y'all enjoyed the tutorial. Let me know if you learned something. Let me know in the comments what you want to see next. Make sure you check out the Patreon, $10 subscription for the classes with all the DK members. The link is in the description. Also, go follow us on Instagram. The link is also going to be in the description. We're going to be posting the placements we get on there. Make sure you like the video, subscribe, and I'm going to see y'all next time.